My brother was the most self-sufficient man I had ever known, and our grandmother was the most dangerous woman in 3 counties. I say dangerous because she was never wrong about people, not once in 81 years, and she had a habit of arranging things so quietly that by the time a man understood what had happened, he was already grateful. What happened to my brother Edmund, the Duke of Caelmoor, in the autumn of his 38th year is the story I have been asked to tell more times than I can count. I was there for most of it. What I missed, Edmund told me himself, in the long evenings after everything had settled, and the house had gone quiet in the way that only a truly contented house can. So I can account for it all. I will begin where it began, with grandmother's letter. Edmund received it on a Tuesday morning in October at his desk in the North Library of Caelmoor Hall, which was the room he used to communicate to the world that he wished to be left alone. The fire was lit, the dogs were at his feet, and he had been working since before dawn on the tenant yield reports for the eastern farms. He was, by his own admission, content. He had ordered his life to a precise and functional arrangement, and he saw no reason to disturb it. The letter arrived on a silver tray. He read it once, set it down, read it again, and then came to find me in the billiards room, which was where I generally was when I had no particular reason to be anywhere else. "Grandmother is coming," he said from the doorway. I looked up from my shot. "When?" "Friday. She is bringing a young woman she would like me to meet." He paused. The word meet carried everything he meant and everything he resented. "She has described her as a person of excellent character and very modest means." "Oh," I said. "She has also described her as not what you expect, Edmund, and therefore exactly what you need." I set down my cue. "That is rather specific." "Grandmother is never vague when she is being purposeful." He crossed his arms, which he only did when he was uncertain. Edmund uncertain was a rare and interesting sight. "I have no intention of entertaining matchmaking schemes in my own house. I am 38 years old. I have managed Caelmoor, the London property, and the Yorkshire holdings without assistance for 16 years. I do not require a wife selected by a woman who still sends me a new pair of gloves every Christmas as though I am 9. "She also sends you brandy," I pointed out. "The brandy I accept, the wife I shall politely decline." He went back to his library. I finished my billiards game with considerably more interest than I had started it. Grandmother arrived on Friday at 2:30, in her ancient coach with her 2 terriers and her particular lady's maid, who had been with her for 40 years and shared her gift for silent, devastating assessment of any room she entered. The young woman came in behind her quietly, carrying a small traveling bag that she did not surrender to the footman until he asked twice. Not from rudeness, I understood later, but because she was unused to footmen asking to carry things for her. Her name was Miss Wren Calloway. She was 24, the daughter of a scholar who had died 3 years prior, leaving nothing but a library, and the library had been sold to pay his debts. She had been employed since as a reader and correspondent for grandmother's oldest friend, Lady Pembroke, who was 83 and whose eyesight had failed entirely. When Lady Pembroke had gone to her daughter's house for the winter, Miss Calloway had found herself at liberty, and grandmother, who had met the girl precisely twice but claimed that was sufficient, had taken the situation in hand. I was in the entrance hall when they arrived, because I am not a man who misses arrivals he has been anticipating. My first impression of Miss Wren Calloway was that she was everything the word, unassuming, was invented to describe. She was of middling height, with brown hair dressed plainly, a gray traveling coat that had been turned at the cuffs, and an expression of careful composure that looked neither anxious nor defiant, simply watchful. She took in Caelmoor's entrance hall with its vaulted ceiling and its ancestral portraits and its general atmosphere of centuries-old importance, and she did not seem awed or diminished. She seemed, if I had to name it, interested. Grandmother introduced us. Miss Calloway curtsied, thanked me for the welcome, and asked, before any of us had moved toward the drawing room, whether the family in the 3rd portrait along the east wall was of Caelmoor origin or a connection by marriage, because the likeness to the man in the 2nd portrait was striking, but the heraldic device was different. I told her it was a marriage connection from the previous century, and that the discrepancy in the devices had puzzled the family archivist for 30 years. She said, "I wonder if the archivist has looked at the land grant of 1704. The device changed when the estates were consolidated. I read something similar in a correspondence I was cataloging for Lady Pembroke last spring." I liked her immediately. I'm a straightforward man in that regard. Edmund appeared at the library door at that precise moment, summoned by the noise of arrival, and stopped. He took in Miss Calloway with the expression I had seen him use on tenant disputes and parliamentary documents, a rapid, thorough assessment that gave nothing away. She turned from the portrait, saw him, and curtsied again. He bowed. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Your Grace," she said. There was a pause. Grandmother, who had the conversational instincts of a general, filled it immediately by announcing that she required tea and that someone should show her to the blue drawing room before her niece registered a formal complaint. The party moved. I watched Edmund watch Miss Calloway walk ahead of him down the corridor, and I thought, this will be more interesting than he expects. Tea was what teas at Caelmoor always were, excellent in substance and formal in structure. Edmund sat at the head of the table and asked Grandmother about her journey and her health and the health of her terriers. He asked Miss Calloway with careful courtesy about her time at Lady Pembroke's, about the nature of her work there, about whether she had found the winter in Devonshire mild. She answered without elaboration and without the nervous chattiness that sometimes afflicts people who are trying very hard to make a good impression. She did not try very hard. She simply answered and asked a question in return when it was natural to do so. Edmund, I noticed, answered her questions fully. After tea, Grandmother announced that she would rest before dinner and took herself off with her maid and her terriers. The dismissal of Edmund and Miss Calloway from the room was accomplished so smoothly that I believe they were halfway down the corridor before either realized they had been arranged into a promenade without their consent. I had a letter to write. I went to write it. I was not so indelicate as to follow. What happened on that walk I know from Edmund, who told me about it 3 months later, sitting by the fire after Christmas dinner when I finally asked him directly. He said they walked the length of the gallery, which is a long gallery, and that he had intended to be pleasant and efficient and to discharge his duty as a host before returning to his reports. He had not intended to stop at the window that overlooks the north garden. He had not intended to say, "Do you know anything about gardens?" And she had said, "Almost nothing. But I know what that plant is. If you mean the one with the silver leaves, it's Artemisia, and it should not still be flowering at this time of year, which means something in the soil here is unusual." He had turned and looked at her then properly, and asked how she knew that if she knew almost nothing about gardens, and she had said, quite simply, "I read. Lady Pembroke had a treatise on northern English soils that I worked through last February because there was very little else to do in February." He had laughed. He told me he had laughed without intending to, and that was the thing he remembered most clearly, the specific surprise of it. They were late coming down to dinner. Grandmother, already seated, said nothing, but I watched her terriers settle at her feet with the particular air of satisfaction that old dogs share with clever women who have gotten exactly what they planned. Dinner was lively. Edmund, who normally dispensed with conversation at his own table as efficiently as he managed everything else, argued with Miss Calloway about the corn laws, or rather, she offered a quiet observation about their effect on small tenant farmers in the north, and he disagreed, and she did not retreat. She cited figures. He cited different figures. She pointed out that his figures addressed export yield but not subsistence cost, and the distinction was material. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you read that?" She named a parliamentary report from 1821. He asked if she had read the supplementary correspondence. She said she had not been able to obtain it, but had read a summary in a journal of political economy. He said the supplementary correspondence substantially altered the picture, and he would find her a copy if she was interested. She said she was very interested. I caught Grandmother's eye across the table. She was eating her soup with perfect serenity. The following morning, Edmund did not go to his library. This was, in 11 years of visiting Caelmoor in autumn, something I had never witnessed. He appeared at breakfast at the usual hour, ate with the usual efficiency, and then, instead of disappearing through the library door, he asked Miss Calloway whether she would like to see the estate records room, as it contained correspondence going back to the previous century and might settle the question of the heraldic device she had noticed in the entrance hall. Miss Calloway said she would like that very much. She did not look surprised, which I thought was exactly right. They were in the records room for 4 hours. I know something of what passed between them in there, because Edmund described it later with the care he gave to things that had mattered to him, working backward from the outcome to reconstruct the shape of how it had arrived. The records room at Caelmoor Hall is not a comfortable space. It is long and narrow and lit by two high windows, lined floor to ceiling with shelving, and the shelves hold correspondence and ledgers and estate documents going back to the reign of the third Duke, who had kept meticulous records of everything from the annual wool yield to the names of every tradesman who had supplied the household with candles. Edmund had organized the room himself as a young man and knew where everything was. He had believed until that morning that he was the only person who could find anything in it quickly. Miss Calloway had found the land grant of 1704 in 11 minutes. She did not announce this as a triumph. She set it on the reading table, opened it to the relevant passage, and stepped back so Edmund could see. He read it in silence. She waited in the same silence, and he told me afterward that there was a quality to her waiting, not an expectant waiting, not a waiting that wanted acknowledgement, just a waiting that was comfortable with the result regardless of what he said about it. He said, "You were entirely correct." She said, "The device change is documented on page 4 as well, if you need the fuller account." He turned to page 4, he read it. 30 years, he said. The archivist spent 30 years on this. The archivist was looking in the estate correspondence, she said. The land grants are filed separately, and this one is misfiled under the Southern holdings rather than the Northern. It was an easy error to make. A pause. Though I suspect no one thought to look for an easy error. He looked at her then. She was studying the shelf behind his shoulder, cataloging something else with her quiet attention. He asked her, with a carefulness he did not always bring to questions, whether she had enjoyed the work she had done for Lady Pembroke. She said she had, genuinely, that she had been given a great deal of liberty to read as she chose, and that liberty had been the better part of it. He asked what she had chosen, and she named a list that took him sufficiently by surprise that he asked her to repeat it. She repeated it without embarrassment. The list included 3 works on agricultural economics, a treatise on Roman land tenure, 2 volumes of botanical correspondence from the last century, and a comprehensive history of parliamentary procedure that she had read because it had been on the shelf, and she had run out of other options one February. He said, "You read it because it was on the shelf." She said, "One should never waste a shelf." He laughed again. He told me he had not expected to laugh twice in the same week. He had not, to his recollection, laughed unexpectedly even once in the preceding 3 months. I took grandmother's terriers for a walk in the north garden, which the Artemisia was indeed still flowering in at an unseasonable rate. "You are pleased with yourself," I said to grandmother at luncheon. "I am always pleased when things proceed as they should," she said. "He will resist." "Of course he will. He has been the Duke of Caelmoor for 16 years without anyone to tell him a thing he did not already know. That is a deeply comfortable position, and no one surrenders it easily." She added a little cream to her soup. "But she is not trying to take it from him. That is why she is the right one." I thought about that. She is not trying to impress him at all, is she? She is not trying to do anything except be exactly what she is. "That," said grandmother, with the finality of a woman who had been correct about people for 81 years, "is the rarest quality in the world." The friction came on the 3rd day. I was not there for it, Edmund told me, but I have heard enough of his voice when he speaks of it that I believe I understand it. He had been in the records room again with Miss Calloway, and they had found the land grant of 1704, and she had been right about the device change, and he had stood looking at the document she had laid open on the table while she traced the relevant passage with her finger, and he had felt, he said this carefully, choosing the words as he chose everything, precisely. He had felt the quality of the silence between them as something he did not wish to break, and that had frightened him. Not the way a man is frightened by a sudden thing, but the way he is frightened by something he has been avoiding for a very long time and has just found himself standing directly in front of. He stepped back. He said something about the light and closed the records room for the morning. At luncheon, he was formal in the way that Edmund Formal was unmistakable, careful, courteous, 3 degrees cooler than his natural temperature. Miss Calloway did not react. She talked to me about the Artemisia and the soil composition, and she thanked Edmund politely for the morning's work in the records room, and she asked grandmother about Lady Pembroke's daughter. After luncheon, she went upstairs to write letters. Edmund went to the library. I gave him 2 hours, and then I knocked. He was at his desk, but nothing on it had been moved. The reports he had been working on when grandmother's letter arrived were in exactly the position they had been in 4 days ago. His dogs looked at me with the expression dogs have when they have been trying to comfort a person who will not be comforted and are glad of reinforcements. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong?" I said. "Or are we going to conduct an entire visit with you making yourself miserable for no reason either of us will acknowledge?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside the library window, the late afternoon light was going gray against the hills, and the sound of the wind in the eaves was the particular sound that Caelmoor made in October, steady, indifferent, ancient. Then he said, "She will leave." I waited. Whatever grandmother has arranged, whatever the week becomes, it will end. She will go back to a position somewhere, some reading work, some letter-writing work, because she has no family and no money, and the world offers women in her position very few other roads. And I will be here, with my reports and my dogs and my perfectly ordered life, having—" He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose, which was a thing I had not seen him do since the year our father died, and the weight of the dukedom had landed on him without warning. "I have been managing Caelmoor for 16 years without disruption," he said. "I know exactly how that works. I know the parameters of it." "Edmund," I said, "you are afraid she will leave because you want her to stay." He said nothing, which was, for Edmund, the same as saying yes. "That is an argument for telling her so," I said, "not for manufacturing a reason to drive her away before she gets the chance." He looked at me then. My brother Edmund does not often look uncertain. He looked uncertain in the way of a man who has spent 16 years being certain about everything, and has run directly into the one thing that his certainty cannot navigate. "She has nothing," he said. "No position, no family, no prospects. If I speak and she accepts from necessity, from calculation, because the alternative is another hired position in someone else's cold house, I will never know whether." "Edmund," I stopped him. "You have spent 4 days with a woman who corrected you on parliamentary economics at your own dinner table and did not soften it by a single degree, who found your 30-year archival question in 11 minutes and then went straight on to the next shelf, who has read 3 volumes on agricultural economics for pleasure in the middle of February." I looked at him steadily. "Does she strike you as a woman who does things from calculation without knowing she's doing them?" He was quiet. "She is not a charity case," I said, "and if you treat her like one, she will know it immediately and she will leave of her own accord and you will deserve it." I pulled a chair from the wall and sat down. "She is not a woman who needs your management. She needs," I thought about what grandmother had said, "she needs someone who wants exactly what she already is." My brother looked at the unworked reports on his desk for a very long time. I watched the dogs rearrange themselves around his chair with the patient wisdom of animals who have outlasted many such silences. Then he said, "Go away, please." I went away. I walked in the north garden for an hour. The artemisia kept flowering. I thought about how the best things very often happen in the most uncomfortable way, and how that seems to be the design of them. It was Miss Calloway herself who told me what happened next, much later, in the straightforward manner she had for all things. She had been in the small sitting room off the east corridor, writing to Lady Pembroke's daughter about a possible position for the spring when Edmund knocked. He did not come to deliver a report or offer an excursion to the records room. He came in and stood near the window in the thin late afternoon light and said, "I owe you an apology for this morning. I was abrupt, and you had done nothing to deserve it." She said she had not taken offense. He said he was glad, but that the apology was due regardless. There was a silence. He remained at the window. She set down her pen. "Your Grace," she said, "you do not have to manage my feelings on the subject. I am quite accustomed to making my own assessments." A pause. "I am aware that your grandmother arranged this visit with a particular intention. I was aware of it before I came, and I told her honestly that I had no expectation of any outcome. I did not come to impose upon you or to—" "You haven't," he said, and then more quietly, "the opposite." She was still. He turned from the window. The late light was on his face, and she said, when she told me about it, that she had seen something in his expression that she had not seen in the 4 days of their acquaintance. Not the assessed and filing away expression, not the debate at dinner expression, but something that looked almost like the absence of his usual arrangement. Unguarded. He said, "I would like very much for you to stay, not as a guest, not as a managed situation. I would like," he stopped, began again. I have been the Duke of Caelmoor for 16 years, and I am accustomed to knowing what I want and proceeding to obtain it with efficiency. I find that this is different. Another pause. I find that I am asking. Miss Wren Calloway looked at him for a moment. She had been writing a letter about a position for the spring. She had been planning a road forward that contained, as she told me, no particular hope of happiness, only the reasonable expectation of usefulness and quiet. She had not come to Caelmoor expecting anything, because she had long since learned not to expect things that the world seemed determined not to offer women in her position. She said, "I appreciate that you are asking. I know it isn't your habit." He said, "No, it isn't." She said, "What exactly are you asking?" He said, after a moment, "I would like you to read my Corn Law's supplementary correspondence, and then I would like your opinion of it, and then I would like to know whether you would be willing to continue that conversation indefinitely." She said, "That is a very oblique proposal, Your Grace." He said, "Yes, I am aware of that." She said, "Is it a proposal?" He said, "I would very much like it to be, if you are not opposed to the idea." She looked at him for a long moment. She told me afterward that she was thinking, in that moment, not about the estate or the title or the cold financial arithmetic of what it would mean to be the Duchess of Caelmoor instead of a letter reader for hire. She was thinking about the records room and the land grant of 1704, and the dinner table and the corn laws, and the north garden with its unseasonably flowering artemisia, and the fact that in 4 days she had argued with the Duke of Caelmoor about economic policy and been taken entirely seriously. And that was a thing she had not experienced in 3 years of being useful and invisible. She said, "I am not opposed to the idea." Edmund exhaled. She said it was the first time she had seen him do so, as though he had been holding his breath for longer than just this conversation. He crossed the room. He took her hand carefully with the particular care of a man who does not do things carelessly, and he bowed over it, which was, for Edmund, the equivalent of a declaration. She did not laugh at him. She understood the seriousness of it. They came down to dinner together. Grandmother looked at them once and returned to her soup. Her 2 terriers lifted their heads from the hearthrug, regarded the scene with ancient canine wisdom, and went back to sleep. I raised my glass to grandmother across the table. She said very quietly, "I told you." The engagement was announced before the week was out. Society, for reasons that society never entirely understands about itself, had opinions. They said she was nobody. They said she was a penniless reader, a hired companion, a girl without family or fortune or the faintest claim to a title. They said the Duke of Caelmoor, who was, by universal agreement, the most eligible, most reserved, most apparently self-sufficient duke in the north of England, had lost his considerable mind. Edmund read the opinions once and set them aside. He sent Miss Calloway, by then she was simply Wren in the privacy of the library, though the proper forms were maintained before company, a copy of the Corn Law's supplementary correspondence, annotated in his precise handwriting, with a note that said, "Your point at dinner about subsistence cost was correct, and my figures were inadequate. I should have conceded the point more readily." She wrote back, "I was prepared for you to be more difficult about conceding it. Your note is appreciated. I have revised my own estimate of the export yield in light of the supplementary data, and I believe you were right on the Eastern figure." She had attached her revised calculations. He showed me the letter that evening. He was smiling in the quiet, almost hidden way he had when something had genuinely pleased him. "She corrected herself," he said, "without being asked." "Yes," I said. She did not need to send the revised calculations. She sent them because the argument warranted it. "I know. That is," he looked at the letter in his hand, "that is exactly the kind of person she is." "Edmund," I said, "I have been trying to tell you that for a week." He folded the letter with care, put it in the inside pocket of his coat, where I noticed, over the following months, he put all of them. The wedding was in the spring, at the village church on the edge of the Caelmoor estate. Wren had asked for the village church rather than the cathedral, and Edmund, who would have arranged a cathedral without thought, agreed immediately, which told me more than anything else about what she had done to his particular certainties. She wore her mother's lace, repaired and pressed, brought out of the one trunk she had managed to keep through the debt sale, over a cream silk gown that grandmother had, with a characteristic quiet authority, arranged to have made. She carried no flowers because, as she told me, she did not know what flowers Caelmoor grew in spring, and she did not want to carry something she didn't know. The village church was full. The tenant farmers came. The household came. Grandmother sat in the first pew with her terriers at her feet, in direct contravention of every rule about dogs in churches, and nobody said a word to her about it. Edmund stood at the altar in his dark coat, exactly himself, unremarkable except that he was watching the door with an expression I had never in my life seen on my brother's face, open and still, and without his usual management of it. When the door opened and Wren came through it with the afternoon light behind her, he stepped forward slightly, as though he had intended to stay still and his body had overruled him. She saw him, she smiled. Not a grand, sweeping smile, but the specific smile she had for moments that satisfied her, small and certain and real. He offered his hand as she reached him. He did not speak because Edmund did not always need to. She took his hand. The ceremony proceeded. I cried, which I will admit to freely because there is no shame in it, and because the vicar was also crying, which made two of us. Grandmother did not cry. Grandmother was, I believe, incapable of it on occasions where she had been entirely correct. But afterward, when the party had moved back to the hall for the wedding breakfast, and Edmund and Wren were standing together near the north garden window in the same spot where she had asked him what exactly he was asking. Afterward, I found Grandmother in the corridor outside, both terriers at her heels, looking out at the garden with a small and private satisfaction. She'll keep him honest, Grandmother said without turning around. I know, I said. He could have managed alone for the rest of his life, Edmund. He was always capable of it. She paused. Capable of it is not the same as it being what was needed. I stood beside her and looked at the north garden. The artemisia was long since cut back for winter, though they tell me it came up again in spring with the same unreasonable vigor. Some things, once they find the right ground, simply refuse to stop. You were right about her, I said. Grandmother turned from the window. Her expression was exactly what it always was when she had been right about a person, not triumph, which was too large and obvious for her, but a very quiet, very deep satisfaction, the kind that only comes from having paid attention to people for 81 years and gotten them right. Of course I was, she said, and went into breakfast. My brother Edmund, the Duke of Caelmoor, spent the remainder of that afternoon closer to the window than to the door, not managing the room, not filing the proceedings. He was talking to his wife, whose brown hair caught the light of the spring afternoon, and who was telling him something that made him listen, not with the expression of a man assessing what he already knows, but with the particular attention of a man who is being told something new, by someone he trusts to tell it true. I remember thinking, that is what Grandmother saw, not a girl with a good position or a useful connection, not a woman who would manage the estate or ornament the drawing room, a person who tells you the true thing, a person who sends you the revised calculations because the argument warrants it, a person who, when you take her hand at the altar, already knows exactly what you mean. He had been the most self-sufficient man I ever knew. He still was in most things. But he had learned that autumn that self-sufficient and whole are not always the same, and that the difference can walk into your entrance hall in a turned gray coat and notice something wrong with your ancestral portraits within the first 5 minutes. Grandmother is 93 now, and still never wrong about people. Her terriers are gone, replaced by 2 new ones who are exactly the same as the first 2 and sit at her feet with the same air of knowing everything. Last spring, Wren's first published paper appeared in the Journal of Agricultural Economy. It was about soil composition in northern England and its effect on certain species of late-flowering plants. Edmund wrote a response in the same journal, the following quarter, agreeing with her central argument and disputing 2 of her subsidiary figures. She disputed his dispute in the quarter after that. She was right about one point and he was right about the other. They agreed on both counts in the final letter, which was published the following spring, and which Grandmother keeps, I am told, on the table beside her chair. We call it in the family the Artemisia correspondence. I do not know a better word for what it is, except that it is exactly what you get when a woman who simply is what she is meets a man who finally stops managing everything long enough to see her. It is quite enough to fill a life,